Hey all, good evening. I've been working on this story for a while. It's a very deep one. It's very extensive, but it's important. So I'm trying to figure out the best way to bring this to you. As you see the title of this video, this is believed to be the EP's, the Ecumenical Patriarch's, final warning to Dumenko. What's the warning for? Well, there are two crucial admissions from the EP that create a crisis. The problem of ordination does exist, and his 7 years of silence did not mean consent. So we will learn what these mean in more detail. He made a speech, an address to the faithful, the people in that area, in Constantinople, on Theophany. I'm just going to point out that he made this speech before they went to that room and he tried to cut the Vassalopita. I want you to remember that. He made this speech before that, and I will get back to that towards the end of this because of the importance. Okay. So he's saying, beneath its carefully measured diplomatic language concealed something far more serious than a festive greeting. So it says it was a warning to Dumenko, possibly the final one. Okay, so what did he say? He says, we have to go with this one must learn to read between the lines of Greek ecclesiastical diplomacy. When the Patriarch speaks of radical measures that should be avoided, he is not referring to abstractions. He means specific churches, specific beatings, and specific seizures. When he urges state authorities to refrain from interference in internal church affairs, that is not generic appeal to secular restraint. It is a direct reaction to what is happening in Ukraine here and now. But we should begin with the most painful point in this address to the OCU. So according to Bartholomew, Patriarch Bartholomew, the so-called, this is him saying this, the so-called problem of the validity of the ordinations of those emerging from schisms is a pretext and a disguised excuse for refusing the hierocratic prerogative of the Archbishop of Constantinople, exhausted through sacrifices and labors. It goes on to say, the issue of restoring and supplying what is lacking without any liturgical rite for clerics emerging from schisms has historically been resolved sufficiently by the single grace that acts mysteriously within sacred celebration, akin to a mystically effective prayer. So he's attempting to explain why Constantinople nevertheless does not resolve the question of the validity of priestly ordination within the OCU. So by saying that, he appeals to the works of two Greek theologians, Bishop Vasilios of Smyrna from 19th century and Gregorios Frangakis, a contemporary, and he studied the question of schismatic ordinations. Their arguments, however, have not convinced the majority of local churches. Okay, so at the same time, this statement constitutes an implicit admission by the Fanner that the problem of ordination does exist, yet it also makes clear that Constantinople has no intention of resolving it. Now, remember I did a video on this where he was thinking about revoking the Thomas, but then he was like, no, we can't do that because of the reputation of the Fanner and him and everything. Well, this is about what it is. Okay, so he basically, urging of the state authorities to refrain from that. Yeah. So when he's saying that he asked the states to refrain from the interference, it's a calculated move. It's a calculated move to sever the OCU's reliance on political support and to listen to him, to be back under the EP's own authority. Okay? This public warning creates a record, right? If the OCU ignores it, the EP has now publicly been justified taking more severe steps later without appearing capricious. So he's saving his own self by putting this out there in his address, saying, see, I'm telling you what you need to do. You need to come back under me. And stop with the seizures of the churches and the destruction and all that they've been doing, right? But let's go over this issue he's talking about with the canonical of how you bring in schismatics. Okay, so for example, in 1995, Constantine Bagan and the schismatic structure he headed submitted a petition to the Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarchate requesting reception under the Amophorion of the EP. On March 12, 1995, the Synod of the Church of Constantinople granted the request. This was followed by the reordination of the hierarchs and clergy of the former UAOC Metropolia in the United States, an act carried out without public attention. After that, Constantine Bagan received the title of titular Metropolitan of Uranopolis and was appointed head of an autonomous metropolia of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in the United States. But when addressing Dumenko, the EP proposes an entirely new approach, simply to concelebrate together. In other words, he effectively proposes to disregard canonical problems altogether. This is not a solution to the problem. It's an attempt to suppress it through silence. So, it's also significant, the author says, that Bartholomew has spoken about this almost openly for the first time. So, previously he carefully avoided the subject. Yes, so he's made this public address. That's a pretty big deal. Now, suddenly he acknowledges, yes, the problem exists, but we will not resolve it. Why? Because any concrete solution, whether the canonical recognition of those ordinations as unquestionably valid, or the reordination of schismatics, which in fact amount to a first ordination, would generate new and even more serious problems. Okay. So, if the EP were to declare these ordinations fully valid, it would create a precedent that other schismatics could invoke. If the ordinations of Dumenko performed while he was under anathema are valid, why should ours be invalid? This would create additional difficulties for the Theophany itself. In Greece alone, there are large numbers of clergy whom the Theophany and Greek hierarchs considered old calendrist schismatics, and whose ordinations they do not recognize. On the other hand, the reordination of OCU clergy would amount to an admission that for 7 years this structure existed without canonical ordained priests. Think about that. So the EP chooses a third path, a mystical fog of grace in concelebration. This approach is not only canonically unsound, but also deeply strange. By such logic, one could consider a person baptized simply because he happened to receive communion. Or one could regard communion as sufficient for the forgiveness of sins, rendering confession unnecessary. It is obvious that such a position is capable of producing genuine chaos within orthodoxy. So, he says here, we were silent, but that did not mean agreement. So, this is the second part. What is he meaning? So he addresses his address sounds almost like a repudiation of his own policy of recent years. If from our humble silence, this is an important quote, if from our humble silence anyone formed the impression that we were guided by motives other than ecclesiastical in this matter, we ask forgiveness. This is an astonishing statement. For 7 years, Constantinople remained silent, observing what was happening in Ukraine. For 7 years, representatives of the OCU seized churches, beat priests of the UOC, and with the support of the state, forced believers in the canonical church out of their temples. Throughout all this time, the Phanar said nothing. More than that, through the Tomos, it legitimized precisely the OCU, providing it with a canonical foundation and a form of protection, which Dumenko's clergy constantly invoke to justify their actions. Suddenly, the Patriarch declares, "Do not assume that our silence meant consent." If it did not mean consent, why was the voice of the Phanar not heard? Why did Constantinople not restrain Dumenko when he turned church life in Ukraine into a war aimed at eradication? Why was there not a single official statement from the Phanar condemning violence, state pressure, or the seizure of the churches? The answer is simple and deeply uncomfortable. The Phanar remained silent because that silence was convenient, according to this author. While the OCU was gaining strength, while transfers of churches were being carried out with crowbars and angle grinders, while it appeared that the project of Ukrainian autocephaly was proceeding according to plan, Constantinople had no reason to intervene. Silence was a tactical choice. Now, however, something has changed. Patriarch Bartholomew is forced to distance himself from methods that he had tacitly tolerated for 7 years. Okay. He says, seek ways of rapprochement with the bishops of the UOC through dialogue. That's what he urged Dumenko to do. He also addresses the hierarchs of the OC. We call upon the venerable hierarchy of Metropolitan Onufri remaining in Ukraine to reconsider its position. We call ourselves and one another to intensified prayer, above all for ecclesial peace. The words sound beautiful, even Christian, but what do they mean in practice? First, they mean that the Phanar has recognized that the coercive scenario has failed. After 7 years of extreme pressure, the UOC has not been broken. On the contrary, it has preserved its identity and its canonical status, while the plan to transfer all Ukrainian Orthodox under Constantinople has collapsed. Second, this is an attempt to shift responsibility for reconciliation onto the victim of aggression. In effect, Bartholomew is saying to the UOC, enter into dialogue with those who are destroying you. But what kind of dialogue is possible when one side, with the help of state authorities, seizes hundreds of churches and beats believers while the other side struggles simply for the right to exist? So, the author goes on and says, in this context, Patriarch Bartholomew's call for dialogue amounts to the legitimization of seizures. In essence, it becomes negotiations between a victor and a defeated party, where the latter is expected to capitulate under the guise of reconciliation. Third, the most cynically, the call for dialogue creates an alibi for Constantinople itself. When the UOC quite predictably refuses dialogue under such conditions, the Phanar will be able to say, we offered peace and they refused. Any refusal will then be used as proof of intolerance, obedience to Moscow, and similar accusations, providing further justification for intensified pressure. To the state, do not interfere. As he said, we recommend that state authorities refrain from interference in internal church affairs, as I said. But where were they before? So it sounded correct. Where were they before, right? Where were they where were these words when law number 8371 was adopted, which the American Orthodox protested about at the Capitol, effectively banning the activity of the UOC? Where were they when the state carried out mass seizures of UOC churches and just transferred them to the OCU? Where were they when law enforcement used tear gas against believers defending their shrines? Today, state interference in church life in Ukraine has reached an unprecedented scale. There is no longer merely pressure. It is the use of a church schism as an instrument of state policy. And all of this has occurred with the silent approval of Constantinople. Okay, so now when persecution of the OC has taken on the character of an outright religious purge, Patriarch Bartholomew suddenly asked the state not to interfere. But the obvious question remains, what if the state refuses? Too much has already been invested in the image of a Moscow church for the launched mechanism of hostility to be stopped so easily. Will Constantinople revoke the Tomos of the OCU? No. Will it reconsider its relationship with the politicians who initiated the persecutions and cease receiving them at the Fanar? Highly unlikely. Will it initiate church trials against OCU clerics who organized violence? Also no. We have mentioned only ecclesiastical measures that Constantinople could apply to those who interfere in church affairs. Yet even though these are not being employed. Therefore, the Patriarch's words about non-interference remain an empty declaration. This appeal serves as an alibi for the future. When the persecutions end, as they inevitably will, and those responsible are held legally accountable, the EP will be able to say, I'm not guilty. I asked them not to interfere. I opposed violence. At the same time, he took not a single concrete step to protect the persecuted, limiting himself to hollow diplomacy, which amounts to complicity through inaction. Let's understand why the EP has suddenly decided to distance himself publicly from the methods of the OCU. One must consider the broader context beyond the speech itself. Okay, so according to the sources close to the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Fanar has been dissatisfied with the behavior of Theophany, Dumenko for quite a while. Yes, I did a video on that last month. The violence displayed by OCU parishioners and clergy toward the UOC creates an extremely damaging image for Constantinople. Within the Fanar, there are ongoing discussions about the possible replacement of the head of the OCU, since he is considered unable to cope with the task assigned to him. Okay, well, what task is meant? Clearly not the task of destroying the UOC at any cost. The task was different, to create a united autocephalous church in Ukraine under the Omophorion of Constantinople, an influential and respected institution, a church that would attract the majority of believers not by force but by authority, a church that would become an example of proper autocephaly under the patronage of the Fanar. Instead, OCU has turned into an instrument of the forceful redistribution of church property, so on, as we know. The violence and everything. All of this is happening in full view, the entire Orthodox world. This represents an unmistakable failure by the EP. Not merely the collapse of a single project, but a blow to the very idea of Fanariate primacy. Other local churches observe Ukraine and see where Constantinople's intervention has led, what the Tomos has produced, and what methods are used by those whom it has blessed. Naturally, all of this together creates a serious problem for the future. And why won't all these other churches come together, bring him in there, and discuss this in some kind of council? Wouldn't that be nice? Isn't that the responsibility of the church? Let me know. What do you think on that? Naturally, all of this together creates a problem. If the Fanar does not distance itself from the methods of the OCU, it risks losing what remains of trust and respect among local churches that clearly see what is happening in Ukraine. So, his address on Theophany, to state publicly, albeit a characteristically Greek and diplomatically veiled manner, to Dumenko, you have gone too far. So, for Epiphany, the words of the head of the EP constitute an extremely harsh signal. For the first time in 7 years, Patriarch Bartholomew publicly expressed his satisfaction with the conduct of the OCU, and for the first time, he openly stated, our silence did not mean agreement. So it must have been pretty surprising to Dumenko and his group, right? I would think so. So equally revealing is his phrase, the EP's phrase, we are confident that the experience you have gained will contribute to finding a way out and will demonstrate who truly seeks peace and who inclines toward undesirable intolerance and unrest. These words clearly indicate that Dumenko's actions will now be assessed. And if they continue in the same manner, the consequences may be entirely predictable. For example, the former OCU priest, Yaroslav Yasenets, which I shared a video on that as well, stated that after the brutal seizures at the UOC St. Michael's Cathedral in Cherkasy, the EP had convened that synod and was possibly going to revoke that Thomas at the time, but they didn't. And there's no doubt the Constantinople exercises full control over the structure and it created. A Thomas can be granted and it can also be withdrawn. Dumenko can be blessed and he can also be removed. And even if today Patriarch Bartholomew promises not to revoke the Thomas, no one knows what tomorrow may bring. So Dumenko now finds himself in a difficult position. On the other hand, he relies on the support of the Ukrainian state, which views the OCU as an instrument in the struggle against Moscow influence. Exactly. It's a tool for them. On the other hand, his legitimacy depends entirely on Constantinople. If the founder decides that Dumenko has a problem, it will find a way to resolve that problem. There is no shortage of precedents. So they think that's his first. They end it with saying that it's the first public warning to this man, and perhaps the last. Now let's couple that with what's happened here. Let's couple that with the fact he publicly did this. The faithful said this out loud to apparently cover his butt, because what this really comes down to is basically it's political, okay? But it's also his idea of trying to cover his bottom and trying to keep his authority here. So this reality, it really comes down to an apology for staying silent, okay? But he repudiates his own, as we said. So he hasn't fixed any of the canonical issues. He won't go back and do the canonical right thing, as we all know. Yet he made this, like I said, this first speech where he admits some things, right? On Theophany. Before he goes into the room with others at the Fanar to cut the Vasilopita New Year's bread. The lights go out. They finally come back on. He goes to cut the bread with the first knife. The knife breaks. The second knife bends. He says it's a bad omen. Is his conscience, is he starting to see through that divine warning? Is he starting to see, oh, wow, I mean, this is a bad omen, probably for me, considering I just did this speech, and I'm not taking full responsibility, I'm not repenting, I'm not humbling myself in this regard. Well, what do you think? Yeah, What do you think on that? So that's an important issue. What in the world is this going to do? What is this going to do? Because I think this ties even more to that bad omen. It lines right up with his speech and what he's doing that's not helping. So, what do you all think on this? I find that timing very amazing because, we didn't know what was going on before that. Now we do know what was going on. We do. That speech. Those two admissions. But not wanting to fix the mistakes he made. Not wanting to do the canonical correct way of bringing in these schismatics. You see what I'm saying? What are your thoughts on this? Please share, because this is an important issue. Very important. And again, I don't think God is happy with him, and I think that was a warning. I think it's even more blatantly obvious now, but that's how I see it. How do you see it? Thanks so much for watching, for following my channel.